thing now, as well as share the slides. So are you seeing the title slide now, Bhaven?
Yep.
Great. All right, I'll turn it over to you. And yeah, just let me know when you want me to advance the slides. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. I asked Josh how many people to expect, and he said between 5 and 100, and I'm glad that he was exactly right. So it's good to see such a nice crowd here. So I have presented some version of what I'm going to discuss today to a different AEA, the American Economic Association, and it's a real pleasure to discuss it with the real AEA, one that's actually concerned with the use of patents for evaluation. And I was thinking to myself that someday I may connect with the Atomic Energy Agency and do the trifecta of AEAs. But for now, I look forward to joining you today, and I'm going to talk about the use of patent and patent adjacent data to evaluate the benefits from publicly funded research, talking a little bit about the history of how patent data have been used, and hopefully building up to today, and the latest and greatest, and what people are doing today. I have a set of slides here. You can see there's 25 slides, but I'm happy to be interrupted and kind of go off course if there's particular questions or you want me to zoom in on particular things. So feel free to do that. Okay. Very good. All right. So some context. I'm gonna talk about patents, and in a sense, the uses of patent data to assess the impacts of publicly funded R&D goes back at least a quarter century. Even beginning in the 1990s, NSF in their science and engineering indicators tried to link patents to public funding using the data available then. But this topic of how you do so, and more generally how you link public funding to impact, has resurfaced recently with the TIP Directorate, ARPA-H, and various other initiatives that seek to promote and evaluate the impact of science and technology investments, not just on scientists or on publications, but on real-world economic outcomes like commercialization and patents and products. And so it's an interesting time to be doing this once again today. What I'll talk about, and again, I'm happy to change course as the audience demands. But what I plan to talk about is just give a sense of how patent data are used in research assessment. What are some of the best practices, tricks of the trade? What, in my view, based on just not my work, but work I've been in the field that I've been following, what's the data frontier, and what might be the road forward? And I'll try to talk about that as well. So next slide. I'm going to start by going back to a paper written by, I think, the grandfather or the godfather, I don't know, of using patents as economic indicators, Zvi Griliches, the late and great Zvi Griliches, who in 1990 wrote this magisterial survey article, which bears going back to even today, on the resurgence of interest among economists in patent statistics as economic indicators. And I want to point you to the opening quote on the bottom right, which is, I guess, an old joke about two people at a Catskills resort, and one begins with, "The food here is terrible," and the other responds, "And the portions are so small." And this line was made famous, as I'm told, by Woody Allen in Annie Hall, when Alvy Singer said, "That's how I feel about life." Well, evidently that's how Zvi Griliches felt about patent data. And I think the good news is at least one of these problems has been solved. The portions are no longer very small, but I think also the quality is improved as well. But that's something we can talk about later on. All right, next slide. So by way of background, and I think I'll go through this quickly since I suspect many of you know this, a patent is a government-granted right for inventors to exclude for a limited period of time others from making, using, and selling inventions. And the purpose of patents is, in the Constitution, to promote the progress of science and the useful arts, meaning to create incentives for innovation. Now, in order to get a patent, you need to, and I'm focusing mainly on the U.S. here, though I think what I'm about to say is true in general. In order to get a patent, you need to convince a patent examiner that your invention is new, useful, non-obvious, and meets various other criterion. And you also need to disclose the invention in a way that enables a person having ordinary skill in the art to be able to reproduce it. And why I say that is just to make the point that, and it's a really important point, that patents are not meant to be counted, right? They weren't designed to be counted. Like many administrative data sets that I suspect folks here are familiar with, they are meant for other reasons, but we as researchers, we as evaluators try to squeeze information out of them, sometimes to the annoyance of folks who actually write these documents and know how the sausage is made, so to speak. But we try. So the next slide goes back to Grillicus here and discusses the promise of patent data. Why are patent data useful for assessing invention and potentially for the links between public sector efforts and invention or innovation? Well, here Grillicus lays out four or five things which I think remain relevant today. The first, I suppose, most trivially is they are available, so we can get patent data, and more so than Grillicus's time. Now, you can download the full text of granted patents and indeed patent applications. Granted patents, I think, with Google and various OCR products, you can get them going back to 1836 in the U.S. Patent applications you can get going back to 2001, and you can get them now more so than in 1990 when Grillicus wrote, in machine readable format that you can load into whatever your standard database is or onto whatever your standard servers are in nice clean format. And so they are something that's widely available. Grillicus also says that they're based on what appears to be a slowly changing standard. What he meant by that is that it's not just like pieces of paper. Some may dispute that, but in order to get a patent, at least nominally, you need to convince somebody at the patent office that your invention is new and actually useful and non-obvious and has inventiveness. And so that's what's meant by that. Maybe more importantly, they are information rich. So if you stare at a patent document, you have information on the inventor, the address of the inventor. You have information on the firm name and the address and the location. You have information on technology classes using standard technology classification systems. Now people use the CPC system. As I mentioned already, those are a long time series, so they go way back in time. And Grillicus noted presciently that one can actually kind of go into the text of patents and kind of tell a little bit of an economic or technological history of it. I put an asterisk next to this because it actually was pretty hard to do in 1990, but now with modern natural language processing techniques and more generally computational techniques, I think it is possible to get into the text of patents and extract concepts and actually really take advantage of information beyond the standard coded fields that were available to economists and others for many years. And I'll say more about that in a bit as well. But at the same time, there are problems with using patent data, and Grillicus certainly gestured towards these. But over the years, over the decades that followed, a number of others have become apparent, and there's large literatures on them as well. So what are some of the downsides? First, maybe most importantly, in most sectors, patents are meant to be a measure of invention, innovation. Won't get into semantics around that just yet, but it's important that in most sectors, and there's probably at this point a 50, 60-year-old empirical legacy in economics suggesting that patents are not the most important way in which firms appropriate returns from R&D. In many sectors, firms use trade secrecy, lead time, and other approaches to appropriating returns from R&D. The most recent evidence on this is from a very nice paper that I can provide a link to, or Josh can, by Mezzanotte and Simcoe, confirming what various surveys over the years have showed, that in some sectors like pharmaceuticals, chemical-based industries, patents are really important mechanisms for firms to appropriate the returns from R&D to prevent imitation, etc. But in many sectors, patents are nice to have but don't have to have, and in some tech sectors, firms just don't bother to file patents because they're concerned about secrecy and whatnot. And I think that's just a really, really important point. Patents are available, they are countable, but they're only giving you a particular lens, and in some industries, perhaps a biased lens into invention and innovation. Related to that point, not all important patent inventions are patented. Again, differences across firms, across sectors, in propensity to patent. But the flip side of that is not all patents are innovations. So though Grillich has talked about this slowly moving standard, research since then suggests that there are, in some fields, concerns about the quality of patents and whether patents are being granted on things that aren't actually all that new or all that useful. I've done some work suggesting that patent examiners vary quite dramatically in their leniency. So in a sense, if you draw one patent examiner, you might get a patent, and if you draw another one, you will not. And applicant effort matters. So for the same invention, an applicant that's willing to try harder might be more successful in getting a patent than others. So all that is to say that you can't necessarily compare one patent to another and assume it's the same kind of unit of innovation. There can be tremendous heterogeneity, both in the quality of patents, but also in the private value and the social value of patents. The implication there is that it certainly, at the very least, it can be hard to compare patents across fields. Patents are used very differently across sectors, but also across countries and perhaps institutions. So think large versus small firms, large versus small agencies, etc. And so against the promise of patent data laid out in the previous slide, there are also well-known perils here. Great. The citation revolution. So one set of approaches that was developed by students of Grillich, Adam Jaffe, Manuel Trachtenberg, Bronwyn Hall, and others in the mid-1990s, starting in the mid-1990s, was the use of patent citation data. And citations were used to both ameliorate some of the problems with simple patent counts that I alluded to in the previous slide, when discussing the previous slide, but also to develop new indicators, including links between different kinds of patents, links between patents and publicly funded research. So let me talk about citations next. Sorry, Josh, can you just go back up one slide? So this is a patent. This is an issued patent in March 2015. And again, I suspect many of you may know this, but just to be safe, as part of the patent process, you have to do you have to report the so-called prior art, which is previous patents and previous publications that bear on the patentability of the application being filed, or material to the patentability of the invention that you're trying to get. And if the patent issues, then this prior art is listed in the references cited section of the patent document. And so one thing that folks have done, and this goes back to, I think, is Francis Nairn and CHI research, even Eugene Garfield before that, but in economics, really pushed by Jaffe and Trachtenberg and others, is to use patent citations to try to adjust the value of patents, just like in bibliometrics, which where you can look at the number of times a paper is cited as a measure of value. there has been citation-based adjustment to the value of patents with the idea that the more highly cited a patent is in later patents, the more valuable it is. And so that's the first way in which patent citations have been used. They've also been used, and here I guess Josh, you can proceed to the next slide. They've also been used to trace linkages between different inventions on the idea that if patent A cites patent B, then patent B, the invention embodied in patent B or the inventor associated with patent B influenced patent A. So there've been on that assumption, there's been lots of work trying to look at what types of inventions are most influential, and here one can look at government-funded patents and how much they're cited by privately funded patents, et cetera, et cetera. So is the logic there reasonably clear before I go on to talking about some of the problems? Speak now or forever hold your peace, as they say, or at least for now, hold your peace. Okay. So on the first use of citation weighting of patents to kind of adjust for heterogeneity in patent value, there has been actually less validation than one would want, but there is some validation going back to Manuel Trachtenberg's work that citation weighted patent counts correlate better with other measures of value than just simple patent counts alone. In my view, at least, and this is the kind of Josh and I were talking before the call about incentives in academic research. In my view, at least, much more validation is needed, but it's the kind of thing that's not sexy for academics to do, or at least it's the kind of thing that incentives in academic science, at least among academic economists, are not well aligned to help generate validation of these kind of citation counts as measures of value. And I think much more needs to be done on that front. That's my editorializing in terms of where we need to go. Best practice today, I think, is not just to look at citations, but actually to look at other value indicators as well. And two other prominent ones that are increasingly used are, one, some work by Kogan et al. KPSS is what it's called, but that's just an acronym for Kogan and Kogan's co-authors, whose names I forget right now. But what they did is for every patent that was issued from, I believe, the 1970s onwards, maybe even further back, for every patent that was issued to a publicly traded firm, they estimated the stock market response to the issuance of that using some I'm told standard finance techniques, and that's a measure of the market value of a patent grant, and that's something that's available now for all patents that are assigned to publicly traded firms. But there are ways, and to the extent you're interested in talking about it more, there are ways we can also impute that to the rest of the patent data as well. A second indicator that's a non-citation indicator that's increasingly used is triadic patent family data. So you can get information from the OECD, from PatStat, and from other sources on the number of countries in which a patent is filed or which a patent is issued. And one common measure is to look at the OECD triadic data to look at, for any given US patent, was it also issued in the European Patent Office, in the EPO, and Japan, on the idea that patents that are filed and issued in multiple jurisdictions are likely to be more valuable than patents that are just issued in the US. And so that's another measure that's kind of available off the shelf as a proxy measure for value. I will say, I say more validation is needed. I don't think all three of these have been kind of cross-validated in the same paper or under the same heading, but my understanding is that each of these has been validated against one another. So there's this kind of, there's these, it's like the three blind men and the elephant in the old fable, I suppose, where we kind of have these multiple imperfect indicators, but they all seem to kind of tell the same story, or at least correlate with one another. But so that's good news. But I think best practice in some sense is, at least among economic researchers, is to not just use citations, but use other value indicators as well. The second thing that citations are used for, as I mentioned, is linkages. Here, I think there's been a lot of questioning, especially on so-called patent-to-patent citations. There is evidence. First, just I think the lawyers, when they see economists using these measures, they complain rightly that these front page patent citations are made for legal purposes, prior art, which I talked about briefly earlier, and that's not quite the same thing as research impact, despite what Eugene Garfield and others might have suggested back in the day. There's been work, and I was involved in some of this work in the early 2000s, suggesting that if you look at the data generating process, a lot of the patent citations, 30–40% come from patent examiners as opposed to inventors. And even among the inventor citations, a lot of them are coming from patent attorneys, not from the inventors themselves. So it's not quite the same as bibliometric citations in that way, in the sense that you have a lot of external influences that may not be so intimately involved with the invention itself generating these things. I mentioned already that patenting varies. Patent strategy varies by firm characteristics, by fields, etc. Patent citation strategy too is a thing that varies with the strategic reasons for patenting. There's been work by Jeff Kuhn and others Alan Marco, Jeff Kuhn and others suggesting that citations, there's just a lot more citation. There's just a lot more citation over time. So there's this what they call citation inflation. So you can't compare citations today to citations 20 years ago. Now there's ways statistically and econometrically you can deal with that problem, but it's just something to, I think, be aware of. And as a result of all of these, just as I mentioned that folks have moved away from simple patent or just citation weighted patent counts as measures of the value of patent, I think folks have moved away from simple patent citations as measures of research impact over the last 5–10 years, opting for other approaches, either in robustness checks or as alternatives in these days. And I'll tell you about some of those. Okay.
Bhaven, I will do a time check. We're at 12:30, so
okay. Great.
Yeah. Okay.
Let me maybe go 15 more minutes. Is that reasonable? You tell me.
Yeah, 15. I think you're given a lot of very useful information, so I don't want to discourage that, but I also, depending on how much you're trying to get through.
Yeah. Why don't I try to give that useful information a little bit more quickly? Yeah. Give me 10 more minutes, because I want to hear what folks are interested in as well. So
yeah, I think 15 minutes is good, and that'll leave us with about 15
very
minutes
good
discussion.
Perfect. Okay, so far I've talked about just patent data in general. I haven't really talked about publicly funded research. Let me just show you two standard measures that are used linking patents to public funding, and then I'll tell you some of the issues there and where that particular line of inquiry is going right now. Okay, so one is, as I mentioned, there is some frustration with using patent-to-patent citations as measures of the impact of research. That's especially true for publicly funded research, especially true for evaluating agencies like NSF or NIH, where a lot of the outputs of that research are not embodied in patents, but rather in publications. So I think one big thing that folks have started doing, one major change in the last 10-15 years or so, is looking at patent citations to publications instead, and then looking at the funding acknowledgments for those publications to link those back to funding agencies. That has two advantages. One, as I mentioned, for many agencies, it's publications and not patents. That's the major output of their work. But second, whereas 30-40% of patent-to-patent citations come from patent examiners, only 3 to 5% of publication citations come from patent examiners. So these are things that are more likely to come from on the inventor side, and for that reason, they're useful. Another thing, and next slide, Josh. Another thing that that folks have started to do is to look at not citations in the patents to publications that acknowledge government funding, but to look at direct acknowledgments of government funding through these government interest statements in patents. And I suspect many of you have seen these. And these two are available now via PatentsView or any standard machine readable patent databases. So just to give you an idea how some of these have been used, next slide, Josh. I've done some work with Frank Lichtenberg, more recently with Lisa Willett, looking at these types of measures to link NIH funding to patents and then to drugs. And that happens to be a context that I've spent a lot of my own time and research thinking about. And I'll say that drugs or the life sciences in some sense are the best case for using patent-based indicators, because pharmaceuticals in particular is one industry where the propensity to patent is quite high. And for various reasons, we think some of the strategic reasons for patenting, while they're present, they're less pronounced in pharmaceuticals than in other industries. So, and the other nice thing about pharma in particular, and this is not true of medical devices or even large molecule biologic drugs, but one of the nice things about looking at small molecule pharmaceuticals and is in some sense unique in the analysis of patent data is you can actually, via the FDA's Orange Book, actually link patents to specific products and then products to sales and even health benefits and whatnot. And so this is a kind of an interesting context. So one thing we did, and I think it's on the next slide, one thing Frank Lichtenberg and I did is way back in 2011 is to take all drugs on the FDA's Orange Book, find all their patents, find all the government interest statements in those patents, so cases where those patents were directly funded by the government, and then also all cases where those patents cited a publication that acknowledged NIH funding. And if you just look at the last row here, there's a lot of information here, so no need to go through it all. But if you look at all drugs approved over the 1988 to 2005 period, about 9% of them had at least one patent with a government interest statement, but about half of them, 47.8%, cited back to either a patent or a publication that acknowledged NIH funding. So we conclude there that the indirect effects of the NIH on drug development are much greater than the direct effects, which has implications for thinking about things like margin rights and whatnot. And again, Lisa Willett and I have explored this. I've updated the numbers and explored it further in a very recent paper, which we can point you to. Another way to use the same sort of measures is prospectively. So this is work that I've done in science with Pierre Azoulay and Danielle Lee, which is we can look at the share of NIH grants that are directly acknowledged in a patent versus the share of NIH grants that generate a publication, which is then cited by a patent. And you'll see on the left panel here that if you give it enough time, about a third of NIH grants result in a publication that's cited in a patent. About 10% of NIH grants, actually about 8% of NIH grants, are directly cited in a in a private sector patent. So those are just some of the ways in which you can. There's a lot more to say about this, of course, but those are some of the ways in which you can use these sorts of data. Why don't we skip forward 2 slides, and others have done this kind of work as well. Why don't we skip forward? This is great. So okay, so I just showed you some of the neat stuff that can be done. What are some of the limitations? I've been spending a lot of time with this now on government interest statements. One is under reporting. The NIH, to their credit, also provides via its reporter database a link to patents reported back to the agency via iEdison. And to my knowledge, it's the only agency that actually makes that publicly available. But if you compare the information in Reporter to iEdison, RT Rye and I showed many years ago that there's not as much overlap as you would hope. There's stuff that acknowledges a government grant in the patent databases, and there's stuff that's not in Reporter, and vice versa. So in a sense, you want to put both of those sources together when evaluating the NIH. But the problem is that the original source, iEdison, is, as to my knowledge, only available for the NIH, is not publicly available for other agencies. So that's an issue. One thing that I've discovered in more recent work is that a lot of the stuff that's reported, a lot of the patents that are reported back to the NIH via Edison but don't appear in the Patent Office records, they actually are in the Patent Office records, but not in the standard front page. But rather they're buried in so-called certificates of correction to the patents, which are not at this point machine readable or readily accessible, and trying to make them so is a project that I and a few others are working on. And yes, Melissa Day points out the hope is that at some point public iEdison, first iEdison will be used across the government, but hopefully some of the patent data in particular will be made available more generally beyond what the NIH already usefully provides. Okay, so that's one limit to government interest statements. I think the key thing is you want to look at certificates of correction as well, and figuring out a way to do that at scale is a problem. It's a difficult thing to do, and a number of teams are working on trying to do that. Second, on the patent citations. There are a number of issues here as well, including just some measurement issues. When you see a patent cite 200 articles, how do you scale that? Do you say that let's say 200 articles coming that collectively acknowledge 30 NIH grants? Like, how do you scale that? And hopefully, I don't need to say too much more than that. Like, do you just divide by n, or like how do you want to think about the cruciality of each cited article or underlying grant to the final patent? And there's questions about what the counterfactual is in that case. So there's just some conceptual and as well as measurement issues there. Second, front page citations to publications, though they have their advantages, which I just laid out, at the end of the day are still prior art. And it's unclear if they too are quite, are quite the same thing as reliance on science or research impact, as I and others have assumed. Let me just say one more thing we've been doing, and then I'll stop and open it up. Next slide, if you can. One thing that I've been doing, that I've done with Kevin Bryan, Yasin Oskan, and now Matt Marks from Cornell and his team has really scaled this up, is to go beyond these front page citations to kind of fulfill this vision that Grillicus has to really take advantage of the patent text, which Grillicus couldn't do in 1990, but now with modern computational techniques we can. So you'll see that beyond the front page citations here on the left, patent documents also have citations in text. For various legal reasons, the in-text citations are even more likely to come from the patent inventor than from the patent attorney or applicant. And we've been able to extract these citations from the text of patents. And the really interesting thing is that they're not overlapping sets. So 75% of the publications cited on the front page are not cited in text, and vice versa, right? So if you do the Venn diagrams, there's a lot of citations on the front page that aren't in text, and vice versa. This paper that I cite to here, we do various things to kind of argue, we think show that in-text citations are more plausibly measures of research impact, or good measures of research impact. Next slide, please. But I've also been involved in I sort of got frustrated in lawyers telling me that these these citations don't mean what you actually think they mean. So I've also actually just surveyed inventors. So I did a survey a few years ago of 10,000 inventors that cite science, 5,000 front page, 5,000 in text, asking them questions like, do you know about this article? Or next page, next slide, Josh. How familiar are you? When did you learn about it? And questions about how impactful this actually was. So spoiler alert, I don't actually have the results here, but it's ready to show today. But suffice it to say that a large share of citations in text or front page don't actually represent research impact, just as the lawyers have been saying all along. One of the nice things about the in-text citations, and this is something I'm working with Kevin Bryan on now, is that there's semantic context. So it's not just a list of citations, but you have some information because it's written in prose about how the citations are used. And what we're trying to do now is to use the semantic context together with the survey results to try to isolate the citations that are really associated with impact. And that's work that's ongoing, but we think we'll have some useful results in the next few months there.
Quick question, Bhaven. So the
Yeah.
survey results, you have the result tied to the patent itself, so you can kind of analyze. Is that right?
So we can analyze what? Yeah.
I'm just saying you can relate the inventor's responses to articles with the actual text of
Yes,
the
yes, it's all based on I went through it quickly, but it's all, you are an inventor on patent number 54321. You cited Einstein et al. 1940. Like, when did you hear about it? How important? Like, could your invention have been developed without it? So trying to get at some of these questions. Yeah.
That sounds really
And again, we're probably a few months away from writing this up, but that's one of the things that we've been working on. And this is something that Francis Nairn years ago suggested doing. He said if he could have done it then, he would have. We're able to do it now. And Matt Marks, and I'll provide you a link at the very end. Matt Marks at Cornell has done it for the universe. So he's scaled up the idea and done it for the universe, and the data are now publicly available in terms of the actual citations. But the validation survey, yeah, we're still working on writing it up and doing some of the natural language processing that I just mentioned.
very
Why don't we
cool.
skip to the very end here? And then we'll open it up. So I already mentioned the issue with government interest statements. I'm working on that. So towards the user guide, next slide. Here are some of the best practices, but rather than going through, why don't I stop here? You can take a look at that if you'd like, and stop here and leave some time for any questions or comments or thoughts you may have.
Great. Yeah, no, this is excellent. A lot of really useful practical information. I will say one thing, getting excited about the description you have about the inventor survey tied to the patents. I know Henry Small, who worked with Eugene Garfield and was really interested in the motivations for citations and things like that, and others did a lot of work in the 80s trying to kind of understand within a peer-reviewed publication what the dynamics around citation were. So there's some similar approaches in terms of asking for the motivations and why people cited certain things. Really fascinating. But
yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just respond to that? Because there's a kind of broader evaluation point just to make here as well. So first, yes, I think that's super important to do, either qualitatively or with a survey. It's actually increasingly hard to survey inventors on patents. First, nobody likes email surveys anymore. People just don't want to answer. You just get so much stuff. Our response rates were actually better on inventor surveys. So it used to be the case that you could get inventor addresses from US patents. And so our mail survey actually got a much better response rate. But we also had patent lawyers and others giving us cease and desist type things, saying stop talking to our inventors. And so it's actually increasingly hard to do that sort of work. We were pretty happy with the 16% response rate we got, but I think that stuff is really valuable. Going back to Garfield and Small was it? I mean, I think it's just really important to understand this, but it's hard to do these days.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. We have four hands up. I'll start with Melissa, and then Jeff, Alexander, Evan, Porozhnik, and Ira Kuhn. So Melissa, please.
Hi. My question is, so for a few years, but not very long, we know that the in-text citations are interesting, but correct me if I'm wrong, but pretty much nobody, none of the big three, are offering this as a data set that's public, right? Like when you see, oh, this is linking in dimensions, when you see, oh, this is linking patent to pub in Web of Science, it's always only front page because the data is basically terrible. Like that's my impression. So do you know if there's a data set people can use? Are any platforms close to releasing this?
Yes. So go to Matt Marks's Reliance on Science database, which is hosted at Zenodo. He's an academic. This is not a commercial provider, but that's, I think, the best. There are several teams that are trying to do this among academics, but I think Marks is the one at least I use as far as, and in terms of the data being terrible. I think actually he's got various quality checks, including against hand codings, I think, and he's got confidence scores on each citation. So you could use that. There's various other teams as well. And if you go to, Josh, if you could just advance the slide. On the right here, the NBR's Innovation Information Initiative, there's a Google Sheet that's linked to there. And you can see various other teams that have provided data sets as well. I personally use Matt Marks's, but that's just because it's the one I'm the most familiar with and feel reasonably confident with if you use his confidence scores as well.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Hey, Bhaven, thanks again for the talk. Always very interesting. I think we have mentioned this before, but I think one of the big black boxes in the understanding patents and innovation is the lack of any data on licensing, and there is no database of licensing. But it seems like licensing is a key kind of dynamic in commercialization. I'm wondering if anybody's actually looked just to see, are there ways to detect like latent signals or some other way to infer those patents that are likely to have been licensed or likely to be licensed, anything of that nature? Like, can we get any kind of signal out there that would help us fill that hole?
Right. I agree. It's just a first order, really, really important problem. Along the lines of not all patents are created equal. I think actually, I would love to see some kind of even a license indicator come out of some of the new iEdison efforts. I think they have the data, and there's questions about quality, but I think that would be great. I'm not holding my breath on that, but that would be interesting. This is not quite answering your question, but another thing that folks I'm very interested, and some of just thinking about commercialization of publicly funded patents, and licensing is one way. One of the things I've been experimenting with is looking at how words move from publicly funded patents into privately funded patents. So take a word that's first used in a publicly funded patent, and then look at if it gets picked up in a private patent, and whether that's not licensing either. It could be through licensing, but it could be through other sorts of spillovers. The only thing I've been able to think of as a latent signal, is and I haven't explored whether this would work, but my understanding here is that when academic institutions get patents, they are classified as, they get small entity fees. If they license to a large firm, then they have to pay, they lose that essentially, right? And so you do see that in the public data. You see if a patent changes status from eligible for small entity maintenance fees to otherwise. I think if you were interested in licenses to large firms, that might be an indicator. But again, I'm sort of in the early 1990s stage of this. Like, it's an idea and someone would need to validate it against some ground truth, and maybe some patent lawyers would tell me it's not a very good idea, but that's the best I can come up with.
No, that's cool. That's last.
Yep.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I have a probably very simple question, but when you're looking at these numbers associated with, say, a number of patents, do you tend to use universally either patent document or patent family as your baseline metric, or is that context specific? That's one of our common points when we're messaging this to other people outside of bibliometrics, of what exactly a number of patents means.
Right. Yeah. And by patent families, you mean US patent families or global patent families?
I think global patent families. I gather that depends on the data provider.
Yeah, I actually think I typically just use number of patents, but I think actually patent families is probably the right thing to use. Was it Evan who asked that question? I think that's probably the right thing to use. I agree, it's a little bit harder to explain, but in terms of best practices, I didn't have that, but actually, I think at the very least, you would want any results you came up with using simple patent counts to be robust to unique patent family counts. So I take the point. Yeah, but I don't do that, but probably should. So it's a good point.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the response, because it seems like a simple question, but in our own work, we don't necessarily have a simple answer either. So I'm glad that it wasn't necessarily like too stupid to ask.
No. It was indeed profound. Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Hi, Bhaven. Great talk.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Very good.
Great talk. Thank you very much. I have two questions. The first one, I was wondering if in your analysis, do you think you would get a different result if you were to dissect it a little bit differently and look at the affiliation of the patent owner, whether, for example, it's an investigator at a university, might be different than a company, because you might have different degrees of that they might be removed from the research, and so those citations, whether in text or front, might be different.
Yep. Yeah. So first, we're looking at that. We're looking at that. Typically, the result. I have to go back through my slides, but what I meant to show in my slides were actually citations from private firms, right? So it's taking out the university and certainly the self citations. Yeah. But let me just try to remember what I showed you. In most of the slides I showed you, there are citations from private firms. Yeah, but I think that's an important distinction. Yeah, because obviously, not necessarily obviously, but yeah, the academic to academic citations would be interpreted differently. Yeah. Good question.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm sorry I wasn't clear. Sorry I wasn't clear.
And I'm going to follow that with a perhaps more naive question of other markers of innovation and beyond commercialization that might have data sets, if you're aware of?
Like what?
I actually don't know.
Sure.
I suppose beyond publications and drug patents.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, okay. So you said beyond commercialization. I'll say that one thing I'm particularly interested in right now, and I suspect others here may be as well, is the use of science in policy And so someone mentioned dimensions. So I am interested in policy documents citing scientific research, and that's another. But I'm trying not to make the mistake that we made using citation data. Were essentially, in some sense, patent citation data, where in some sense the data got ahead of the understanding, and I really would like to try to do some surveys or some qualitative assessments first of when a policy document cites research evidence. What exactly does that mean? And right, so that's one that's one non-commercial outcome to look at. But I should also mention the holy grail in terms of commercial outcomes, and it would be something like an Orange Book across fields, right? There's issues with the Orange Book, and I've written about those as well. Yes, okay, so Jeff pointed this out. Virtual patent markings, which would allow you to associate patents with products in other fields. And again, if you go to the I3 index, there's various teams that have tried to use those data as well. And I see that Jeff points to an implementation report. So Gaetan, who's involved with the I3 effort, has come up with a database of virtual patent markings. Here too, I think one needs to investigate a little bit the data generating process, as well as false positives and false negatives. But I view this as an extremely promising additional lens into the links between patents and products. And so I'm super excited about those efforts as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think we years ago we did some work looking at clinical guidelines and
Yep, right.
their references and then linking those references to funding. So
Great.
And I think that's along the lines of the policy documents. And I mean, you're probably aware, and others on the call may be aware of the Overton product that's available around policy citations. I'm not aware of anyone actually doing a survey of the authors of those policy documents to try and map what they've cited to, you know, to collect more information. But that would be a really nice study along the lines of your inventor survey.
Yes, that's something. Yeah. So if anyone's interested, that's something I'm interested in doing. Yeah, that's something I'm interested in doing.
I'll mention that actually NIST funded some work done, I think it's done by 1790 Analytics, but identifying patents used in standards, and then how we're, or also citation of NIST standards in patents, things of that nature. And so kind of, patents that are related to standards seem to be particularly significant.
Yep, that's great. Yeah, that's another good measure for sure.
Great. We have a couple more minutes. Does anybody have additional questions or suggestions?
Suggestions are particularly welcome.
Melissa's back. Go ahead, Melissa.
I think this is maybe like a trivial question, but is it obvious when you're just looking at a patent which ones were added by the examiner and which were added by the assignee? Or is that like that was a survey that someone got that statistic from?
So since 2001, the examiner citations are listed with an asterisk, and in the public databases, there's like an XML flag cited by examiner. So that's so in that sense, it is obvious.
Got it.
There is work that's been done by Alan Marco, Jeff Kuhn, and others suggesting that you can't 100% trust those flags, in particular around things that were discovered both by the examiner and cited by the applicant. And I'll just put my email in the group chat. If you send me an email, I could send you those papers. My sense is that the flags are still reasonably reliable, but you just have to be careful about what it is how exactly you interpret them. Yeah, but it is available since 2001. Yeah.
That's a DIY. None of, again, the databases that have this data, they're not flagging that for you.
I see. Yeah. Well, so it depends which.
I don't know. I'm asking.
No. So they're available at scale. I said 2001. It might be 2005. They're available at scale through PatentsView, which is the U.S. Patent Office's public database. Yeah. Now, whether they're available in some of the commercial databases, I don't know. So I should say I typically don't use the commercial databases.
Got it.
So yeah.
Great. Then I think we can bring it to a close. I'm going to stop the recording now, but before I do that, thank you again, Bhaven. Really appreciate it. And hopefully, we'd be happy to have you back once you've completed your survey analysis. This obviously a great turnout for the presentation today. So thanks again, and thank you, everyone. And don't forget about the June presentation. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the discussion as well.
Great.